All right, so today we're going to be doing some reading from Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And the reason I'm bringing up this book is because I went into a little bit of a rabbit hole today and discovered that Wilhelm Reich has been greatly influential in establishing something called a forum in intentional communities and new culture summer camps. If you aren't familiar with those, I will link some information below. Um, but the man who established the ZEG Forum in Germany was greatly influenced by Reich. And so I just wanted to kind of go over some of his main beliefs, I guess, as he expresses them in this book. And while I will note that this man who came up with the ZEG Forum currently does not espouse to um, subscribe to Wilhelm Reich anymore, apparently it was something he was intensively interested in, at least in his early days. Um, and I do think it's very clear based on what he has established and the context in which the ZEG Forum exists, which is essentially an open, polyamorous community with, like, kind of, I guess you could say the forum is designed to deal with the inevitable issues that will arise from that sort of situation, and everyone kind of lives together. It's essentially an eco-village thing, but it's like focused on this free love concept. And so I wanted to explore kind of where that comes from. And Wilhelm Reich is from the early part of the 20th century. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with him, but I just wanted to read some excerpts from this book because I think it's quite illuminating what he attributes to social unrest, which is basically people not jerking off enough. Like, literally, that's like literally what he thought. Repression of sexual energy, right? This is why we have things like, the Nationalist Socialist Party of Germany at that time, because people literally are not having sex enough with enough people and what have you. I wish I were kidding, but this guy is sick. He's a very sick man. And it appears that he had a very interesting childhood, had sex with the chambermaids very often, as he details in his autobiography. But I'm going to go over that in a different video. Right now, I just want to cover what he's saying in this book, because essentially what he's saying is the solution to these social issues is to promote sex as much as possible among the populace. And I feel like it's sort of a mind programming technique. And clearly this is something that's become increasingly popular, and it kind of has made people, I don't know, it clearly has not led to a good place, let me put it that way, with the proliferation of pornography and so many other things. So, without further ado, the social function of sexual repression. To help clarify our approach to the investigation of such irrational mass psychological phenomena, it is necessary to take a cursory glance at the line of questioning of sex economy, which is treated in detail elsewhere. Sex economy is a field of research that grew out of the sociology of human sexual life many years ago through the application of functionalism in this sphere, and has acquired a number of new insights. It proceeds from the following presuppositions. Marx found social life to be governed by the conditions of economic production and by the class conflict that resulted from these conditions at a definite point in history. It is only seldom that brute force is resorted to in the domination of the oppressed classes by the owners of the social means of production. Its main weapon is its ideological power over the oppressed, for it is this ideology that is the mainstay of the state apparatus. We have already mentioned that for Marx, it is the living, productive man, with his psychic and physical disposition, who is the first presupposition of history and of politics. The character structure of active man, the so-called subjective factor of history in Marxist sense, remained uninvestigated because Marx was a sociologist and not a psychologist, and because at the time, scientific psychology did not exist. Why man had allowed himself to be exploited and morally humiliated, why, in short, he had submitted to slavery for thousands of years, remained unanswered. What had been ascertained was only the economic process of society and the mechanism of economic exploitation. Just about a half-century later, using a special method he called psychoanalysis, Freud discovered the process that governs psychic life. His most important discoveries, which had a devastating and revolutionary effect upon a large number of existing ideas, a fact that garnered him the hate of the world in the beginning, are as follows. Consciousness is only a small part of the psychic life. It itself is governed by psychic processes that take place unconsciously and are therefore not accessible to conscious control. Every psychic experience, no matter how meaningless it appears to be, such as a dream, a useless performance, the absurd utterances of the psychically sick and mentally deranged, has a function and a meaning that can be completely understood if one can succeed in tracing its etiology. Thus, psychology, which had been steadily deteriorating into a kind of physics of the brain, or into a theory of a mysterious objective Geist, entered the domain of natural science. Freud's second great discovery was that even the small child develops a lively sexuality, which has nothing to do with procreation. That, in other words, sexuality and procreation and sexual and genital are not the same. The analytic dissection of psychic processes further proved that sexuality, or rather its energy, the libido, which is of the body, is the prime motor of psychic life. Hence, the biologic presuppositions and social conditions of life overlap in the mind. The third great discovery was that childhood sexuality, of which is the most crucial in the child-parent relationship, the Oedipus complex, is usually repressed out of fear of punishment for sexual acts and thoughts, basically a fear of castration. The child's sexual activity is blocked and extinguished from memory. Thus, while repression of childhood sexuality withdraws it from the influence of consciousness, it does not weaken its force. On the contrary, the repression intensifies it and enables it to manifest itself in various pathological disturbances of the mind. As there is hardly an exception to this rule among civilized man, Freud could say that he had all of the humanity as his patient. Okay, so basically the reason why we have problems in society is because children aren't being taught to masturbate, is a quick summary of that. So, yeah, this dude is pretty gross. He had an organization where he brought together different psychologists and performed treatments on children, and many of those children accused the doctors of sexual abuse. So that's a thing, too. There's been kind of a lot of scandals surrounding this guy. Anyways, and I think just reading it straight from the horse's mouth is pretty clear. The fourth important discovery in this connection was that, far from being of divine origin, man's moral code was derived from the educational measures used by the parents and parental surrogates in his earliest childhood. At bottom, those educational measures opposed to childhood sexuality are most effective. The conflict that originally takes place between the child's desires and the parent's suppression of these desires later becomes the conflict between instinct and morality within the person. In adults, the moral code, which itself is unconscious, operates against the comprehension of the laws of sexuality and of unconscious psychic life. It supports sexual repression, sexual resistance, and accounts for the widespread resistance to the, quote, uncovering of childhood sexuality. Through their very existence, each one of these discoveries, we named only those that were most important for our subject, constitutes a severe blow to reactionary moral philosophy and especially to religious metaphysics, both of which uphold eternal moral values, conceive of the world as being under the rulership of an objective power, and deny childhood sexuality in addition to confining sexuality to the function of procreation. However, these discoveries could not exercise a significant influence because the psychoanalytic sociology that was based on them retarded most of what they had given in the way of progressive and revolutionary impetus. This is not the place to prove this. Psychoanalytic sociology tried to analyze society as it would analyze an individual, set up an absolute antithesis between the process of civilization and sexual gratification, conceived of destructive instincts as primary biological facts governing human destiny immutably, denied the existence of a matriarchal primeval period, and ended in a crippling skepticism because it recoiled from the consequences of its own discoveries. Its hostility toward efforts proceeding on the basis of these discoveries goes back many years, and its representatives are unswerving in their opposition to such efforts. All of this has not the slightest effect on our determination to defend Freud's great discoveries against every attack, regardless of origin or source. So again, it's setting up this framework of sexual problems on the individual level create problems for society as a whole. Therefore, society as a whole must address sexuality in a systematic way. Psychoanalysis discloses the effects and mechanisms of sexual suppression and repression, and of their pathological consequences in the individual. Sex economic sociology goes further and asks, for what sociological reasons is sexuality suppressed by the society and repressed by the individual? The Church says it is for the sake of salvation beyond the grave. Mystical moral philosophy says that it is a direct result of man's eternal ethical and moral nature. The Freudian philosophy of civilization contends that this takes place in the interest of culture. One becomes a bit skeptical and asks how it is possible for the masturbation of small children and the sexual intercourse of adolescents to disrupt the building of gas stations and the manufacturing of airplanes. It becomes apparent that it is not cultural activity itself which demands suppression and repression of sexuality, but only the present forms of this activity, and so one is willing to sacrifice these forms if by so doing the terrible wretchedness of children and adolescents could be eliminated. The question then is no longer one relating to culture, but one relating to social order. If one studies the history of sexual suppression and the etiology of sexual repression, one finds that it cannot be traced back to the beginnings of cultural development. Suppression and repression, in other words, are not the presuppositions of cultural development. It was not until relatively late, with the establishment of an authoritarian patriarchy and the beginning of the division of classes, that suppression of sexuality begins to make its appearance. It is at this stage that sexual interests in general begin to enter the service of a minority's interest in material profit. In the patriarchal marriage and family, this state of affairs assumes a solid organizational form. With the restriction and suppression of sexuality, the nature of human feeling changes. A sex-negating religion comes into being and gradually develops its own sex-political organization. The Church, with all its predecessors, the aim of which is nothing other than the eradication of man's sexual desires and consequently of what little happiness there is on earth. There is good reason for all this when seen from the perspective of the now thriving exploitation of human labor. We will readily grasp why sex economy views the family as the most important source for the reproduction of the authoritarian social system when we consider the situation of the average conservative worker's wife. Economically, she is just as distressed as a liberated working woman, is subject to the same economic situation, but she votes for the fascist party. If we further clarify the actual difference between the sexual ideology of the average liberated woman and that of the average reactionary woman, then we recognize the decisive importance of sexual structure. Her anti-sexual moral inhibitions prevent the conservative woman from gaining a consciousness of her own social situation that bind her just as firmly to the church as they make her fear, quote, sexual Bolshevism. Theoretically, the state of affairs is as follows. The vulgar Marxist who thinks in mechanistic terms assumes that discernment of the social situation would have to be especially keen when sexual distress is added to economic distress. If this assumption were true, the majority of adolescents and the majority of women would have to be far more rebellious than the majority of men. Reality reveals an entirely different picture, and the economist is at a complete loss to know how to deal with it. He will find it incomprehensible that the reactionary woman is not even interested in hearing his economic program. The explanation is the suppression of one's primitive material needs compasses a different result than the suppression of one's sexual needs. The former incites to rebellion, whereas the latter, inasmuch as it causes sexual needs to be repressed, withdraws them from consciousness and anchors itself as a moral defense, prevents rebellion against both forms of suppression. Indeed, the inhibition of rebellion itself is unconscious. In the consciousness of the average non-political man, there is not even a trace of it. The result is conservatism, fear of freedom, in a word, reactionary thinking. It is not only by the means of this process that sexual repression strengthens political reaction and makes the individual in the masses passive and non-political. It creates a secondary force in man's structure, an artificial interest which actively supports the authoritarian order. When sexuality is prevented from attaining natural gratification, owing to the process of sexual repression, what happens is that it seeks various kinds of substitute gratifications. Thus, for instance, natural aggression is distorted into brutal sadism, which constitutes an essential part of the mass psychological basis of those imperialistic wars that are instigated by a few. So come on, ladies, like, if you don't fuck your boyfriend enough, he's gonna hit you, basically. Like, he's gonna, I don't know, feel the need to commit a violent act is kind of like what this would imply in a hypothetical situation, would it not? To give another instance, from the point of view of mass psychology, the effect of militarism is based essentially on a libidinous mechanism. The sexual effect of a uniform, the erotically provocative effect of rhythmically executed goose-stepping, the exhibitionist nature of militaristic procedures, have been more practically comprehended by a salesgirl or an average secretary than by our most erudite politicians. See, I don't really get anything sexual out of looking at dudes march around, but maybe that's just me. It not only designs flashy uniforms for the men, it puts the recruiting into the hands of attractive women. In conclusion, let us but recall the recruiting posters of war-thirsty powers, which ran something as follows: travel to foreign countries, join the Royal Navy, and the foreign countries were portrayed by exotic women. And why were these posters effective? Because our youth has become sexually starved, owing to sexual suppression. The sexual morality that inhibits the will to freedom, as well as those forces that comply with authoritarian interests, derive their energy from repressed sexuality. Now we have a better comprehension of an essential part of the process of the repercussion of ideology on the economic basis. Sexual inhibition changes the structure of economically suppressed man in such a way that he acts, feels, and thinks contrary to his own material interests. Okay, so that was from the chapter Ideology as a Material Force. I think I might just make this one video, and then I will make a couple follow-up videos reading other parts of this book. All right, thank you.